Thank you for joining us today, and I'm certainly glad to be able to be with you for a few moments this morning through this video. You know, in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, Peter tells us these words, "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps." There's two things particularly in this verse that we want to notice. One is that Jesus is our example. This means it's a word that refers like the blueprint of a building. It is a plan that should be followed exactly. And then the second is that we should be followers of Christ. Since Christ is our example, then we should follow his steps. This means that we should follow his steps exactly, just as close as we possibly can. A common illustration might be that of a little boy trying to follow the steps of his father. As he follows him, he tries to put his foot in the same footprints that his father did. Now, obviously, since his father is much bigger, that might be difficult at times to do, but he tries to do that anyway. And we cannot follow Christ exactly because Christ lived a perfect life, and the Bible makes it clear we can never reach perfection. So therefore, we know we cannot do it exactly, but yet, nevertheless, that should be our goal. We should try to follow Christ just as closely as we possibly can. Now, following Jesus sounds exciting because, after all, Jesus lived like any other human being. He experienced the same emotions that we experience. He experienced some of the same heartaches and trials and struggles that we experience. So we would think then that since Christ knows our life like we do, then he would certainly bless us and help us through all our problems. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way, does it? Matter of fact, the Bible makes it clear that really when we follow Jesus, we should expect the very opposite of what we sometimes expect. Because skipping on down to 2 verses, in verse 23, Peter tells us these words concerning Christ, that when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. That tells us then when people mistreat us, like they often will, just as they mistreated Christ, then we should not try to exact vengeance upon them, but rather we commit things to God who judges righteously. Don't try to get vengeance. Don't return bad for good and that sort of thing. Don't return bad for bad even, but commit it to God. You see, our very existence as Christians involves the idea of suffering. It's easy to say the words, "I will follow Jesus wherever he leads." And I'm sure most all Christians in the world would be glad to say the same statement. "Oh, I will follow Jesus wherever he leads." But are we really ready to do that? Because oftentimes that involves something that we don't want to do. For example, in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 8, the people of Israel made a very bold promise after they had received the law from God himself on Mount Sinai. They said, "All that the Lord has said, we will do." But soon after, they broke most of the commands that they'd just been given. In Matthew chapter 8 in verse 19, a scribe made a very bold statement to Christ. He received the teachings of Christ and he said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Oh, that's a great statement, isn't it? No exclusions. Whatever you lead me, wherever you go, I will follow you. But then notice the very next verse. Christ made the statement, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man have nowhere to lay his head." Now, what was he really saying here? You see, this man had just made a bold promise, "I will follow you wherever he leads." But then Christ was pointing out to him, now that's not going to lead you where you think it's going to go. I can imagine this man having this big visions of what his life following Jesus would be like. Because at that time, the multitudes were following Jesus. He were healing many who were sick of various ailments. I can imagine this man was envisioning a glorious journey, one filled with excitement, amazing miracles, and just memorable event after one another event. Oh, it's going to be a great life. But then Jesus told him something what it's going to actually be. It's going to be a life of hardship. He did not even have a place to lay his head. In John 11, verse 16, and also in verse 13, and verse 37, two of Christ's disciples, Thomas and Peter, boldly proclaimed they would lay down their lives for Jesus. But of course, shortly thereafter, we find that neither was able to fulfill those promises. You see, while we might think that following Jesus would bring great blessings, Jesus usually pointed out the very opposite of that. In the case that we just looked at, when people said they will follow Jesus, Jesus pointed out that following him involves suffering and hardship. Are you willing to boldly make that promise? I will follow Jesus wherever he leads. I hope that you are, but remember that if we were able to make that statement, we need to remember that it likely will not lead us where we think it will. You see, remember again, while we may think following Jesus would bring great blessings, Jesus pointed out the very opposite. For example, in John 12, verse 26, if anyone serves me, let him follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. Now notice Jesus said, where I am, that's where my servant will be. Now since Jesus suffered a great deal while he was on the earth, that means if we're following Jesus, we must be willing to suffer as well. We need to be willing to be a servant. Most people do not want to be servants. To serve Jesus means to follow him, to imitate him, particularly regarding his suffering. We must be completely and totally committed to Jesus and his cause. Are you really willing to follow Jesus wherever he leads? This is difficult to do. You see, while many say they're willing to do that, that commitment is usually only up to a certain point. You see, there's a point to which we're really not willing to go. Now, if there's any point to which we're not really willing to go, then we cannot really make the statement, I'm willing to follow you wherever you lead. Because that statement means there is no point that you will quit following Jesus. Now that's the viewpoint we need to have. But let's think for just a moment about what that really means. You see, when we say we're willing to follow Jesus wherever he leads, that means there is nothing that God would have you to do that you're not willing to do. But many Christians have that point to which they're not willing to go. For example, I've heard some people say regarding being an elder in the Lord's church, I would never be an elder because I'm afraid of what people might say. They might criticize me, and they might well do that, all right. But notice what that person is saying. Here's a person who claimed to be deeply devoted to Christ. But there is one thing for God that he would never do, and that is be an elder in the Lord's church. Why? Because he's afraid he's going to have to suffer a little bit. Was Jesus never criticized? Well, of course, we know that he was. He was willing to be a lot more than just criticized for me. So therefore, why should I be afraid of enduring a little criticism for his cause? Other people would say that they're not willing to leave friends or family to go teach the lost. Some were willing to go next door to teach their neighbor, but to go to another country away from their family and friends, nope, they're not willing to do that. But yet they would say, I'm willing to go wherever Christ would lead me. For others, it means doing those things which might lead to honor and praise. For example, maybe preaching the gospel. Oh, they're proud to do that. As long as people might praise them. It might lead to honor or something like that. But to go somewhere and preach the gospel where it will not lead to honor, oh, they're not willing to do that. Following Jesus means to be ready to do whatever needs to be done, even if it's nothing more than helping others do the work. You see, many people are willing to do great things for God, as I said, if they think it leads to their honor. But they're not willing to do hardly anything when other people might be willing to, or be taking the credit. Too often Christians want to do their own thing without much regard for the work of others. But remember that we need to be working for the growth of the kingdom of God, not my own kingdom, so to speak. And by that I mean trying to increase your own fame, your own applause that you might be receiving from others, your own honor. We should not be worried about a certain legacy. I've heard some people say that I'm trying to leave a legacy. That is something that's going to stay after I'm gone. No, they want people to be speaking well of him and his name long after he's gone. Well, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but that should not necessarily be our goal. Because when we're really following Jesus, then that doesn't mean we're going to be seeking our own kingdom. We're going to be seeking the glory and honor of God. When we're seeking the glory of God, that means we're going to be willing to sometimes to help others grow the kingdom. And when we're helping others, that might not necessarily help you in your honor and your praise. You see, others might receive much of the earthly credit that is done, but you're helping them. That's what we need to be seeking after. Willing to follow Jesus wherever he leads. Rather than seeking your own glory and honor, we're seeking the glory of God. We're seeking the growth of the kingdom of God, even if that means simply helping others do the work so that more people might be brought into the kingdom of God. There's an old song, the song entitled Ready to Suffer. And that echoes this sentiment that we just talked about. Notice a few of the words of that song. Ready to go or ready to stay. Ready my place to fill. Ready for service, lowly or great. Ready to do his will. That's what we need to be seeking after. People simply ready to do God's will. Whether his service is great or it's very lowly. We're going to be willing to do whatever he says. Even if it means suffering, we're willing to follow Jesus wherever he leads. That's a worthy promise to make, but we need to be prepared for what it entails. Following Jesus likely will entail at some point suffering and hardship. Are we willing to do that? We should be, because we can rest assured that if we're really willing to follow Jesus, if we're willing to serve Jesus, as Jesus promised in John 12 and verse 26, if anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. We might not receive the honor of men, but we can rest assured we will receive the honor of God. And that's what we need to be seeking after. I hope that you will seek the honor of God. Thank you.